Good evening and welcome to Panmure House. I'm Professor Adam Dixon and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for our lecture. Just to start, I want to give you a bit of the history of Panmure House. As you know, Adam Smith lived here from 1778 till 1790. And during those 12 years that Smith was here, the house was a hub of intellectual enlightenment and discussion on all the big issues of the day. Today, Edinburgh Business School and Heriot-Watt University have returned it to that purpose. Rescued in 2008, the university spent a decade and £5.6 million restoring it to its 18th century standard, plus a few modern trappings. Now, once again, it is the home of social and economic debate. Panmure House programs are designed to engage us with the big issues that we face today, from Scotland, but also for the world. Tonight, we are delighted to continue one such program, The Lights of Caledonia. The Lights of Caledonia is a series of events designed to celebrate Scotland's intellectual and cultural contributions to the world, and not simply Adam Smith. They are delivered about or by influential Scots who have made a significant positive impact on our society. And we are very grateful to the Friends of Panmure House who have donated generously to fund this series. Tonight, we're discussing a son of Edinburgh, and arguably, you could say, one of the most important modern architects of Britain, Richard Burdon Haldane, the first Viscount of Haldane. And I should say it's not pronounced Haldane, it's Haldane. And we actually have a descendant of Viscount of Lord Haldane here with us this evening. We welcome our distinguished guest speaker, John Campbell, whose book, Haldane, The Forgotten Statesman Who Shaped Britain, which is available for purchase downstairs after the lecture. Haldane wrote, actually, a biography of Adam Smith. And here I have a first edition of that book, which is now part of our library, that was published in 1887. And for Haldane, as I take from Campbell's book, the interplay of economics with national affairs was a constant concern. The thinking of Adam Smith loomed large in Haldane's thinking. Indeed, at a 1907 inaugural address to the Royal Economic Society, Haldane remarked that he praised Smith as a man who had, quote, profoundly freed his mind from every kind of narrowness, end quote. He reminds the delegates in this inaugural address that Smith saw that no economic science was perfect for the purposes of the state unless it was set in the context of its time. And why am I mentioning that is because Panmure House is not a museum. It is not a shrine to Smith. Rather, we see Panmure House and the legacy of Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment in general as an invitation. It's an invitation to forge a new thinking and new ideas on the pressing issues of today. And this leads me to our speaker for this evening, John Campbell. Campbell is the co-founder and chair of Campbell Lutyens, an international private equity and infrastructure advisory house. Born in Newcastle, he lived in Jesmond, close to the childhood home of Haldane's mother as a child. Educated at the King's School, Canterbury, and at the University of Cambridge, where he read economics, winning an exhibition at Sydney Sussex College for his work in economic history. Campbell began his career in corporate finance at N.M. Rothschild, and Campbell was an executive director of Noble Grossart for 15 years, representing the company in London from 1976 to 1987. From 1979 to 1982, he was managing director of McLeod Russell plc, the international agribusiness group with principal operations in Africa, Asia, and Australia. Between 2006 and 2014, Campbell was the first European-based director, and in 2018 was awarded lifetime membership of the US-based Pacific Pension and Investment Institute, a global organization with members from some 50 of the leading pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, endowments, and foundations in the world. And incidentally, I met Campbell for the first time more than a decade ago at a meeting in Manila at the PPI. Campbell has long been inspired by Lord Haldane's example, having first visited Haldane's Scottish home as a child, that is, that home of Cloan in Perthshire, at the age of 12. The book that Campbell will be presenting and discussing this evening has been many years in planning and gestation, and I would say started from that first visit to Cloan as a child. Without further ado, our guest for this evening, Campbell, please.
Adam, thank you
so much.
Indeed. Thank you. Good evening. Adam, thank you very much indeed for those very kind words. I deeply appreciate them, and to be here in Adam Smith's home is something really very, very exciting. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honour to be invited to be with you all and talk about my hero, Lord Haldane. Here in Edinburgh, the city of his birth in 1856, of his education, the city which he knew intimately until his death less than a century ago in 1928. He was extraordinarily multifaceted in his capabilities and achievements. And this is perhaps most efficiently illustrated if you come with me up the Royal Mile to the National Library of Scotland. There can be found the outstanding collection of Haldane papers, principally and so generously donated by Graham Haldane, Lord Haldane's nephew, whose son Dick, I'm delighted to say, my oldest friend, is with us this evening. Graham inherited Haldane's Scottish country home that Adam referred to at Cloan, set in the foothills of the Ochils in Perthshire, with that fantastic view, the panoramic view north over the Grampians, 150 miles from the northeast to the southwest. It was there above all places that Haldane would go to think, and what magnificent thinking he did. The National Library papers provide a formidable record of the effects of that thinking by Richard Burdon Haldane, the first, and being unmarried, the only Viscount Haldane of Cloan. A flavour of Haldane's correspondence in that archive will give you some idea of the breadth of his interests. First of all, the binding thread through the collection are the literally countless letters between Haldane and his formidable mother, Mary Elizabeth Burdon Sanderson. She lived to celebrate her centenary in 1925, predeceasing her elder son, our subject tonight, by only 3 years. So rather like Adam Smith, lived the whole of his life very, very close to his mother. After leaving Edinburgh at the age of 21 for London in 1877, following the death of his father to read for the English bar, Haldane wrote to his mother when away from home almost daily, and also regularly to his sister Elizabeth. And his sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a considerable pioneering public servant and philosopher in her own right. Like Haldane, she never married, but lived between Cloan and her brother's London home for the whole of Haldane's life. This photograph shows Haldane with his mother and sister at Cloan, with Haldane's famous physiologist brother, J.S. Haldane, at back right. Haldane knew just about every significant figure in public life. He was a liberal by philosophy, by instinct and by party, until in the last years of his life, despairing of the liberals' lack of interest in furthering the cause of education, he became in 1924 a member of Ramsay MacDonald's first Labour government. He enjoyed deep relationships across all parties. In certain respects, he was as close to the Conservative politician, philosopher and Prime Minister Balfour as he was to his most intimate Liberal colleagues, Asquith, Grey, Morley, Rosebery. The letters to and from these friends are a total delight, a real insight into life in Haldane's time, and a textbook into how to get things done, to make things happen. In military affairs, after becoming Minister for War in 1905, a position that he held to 1912, he became particularly intimate with French and Haig, who went on to be field marshals, and worked closely and productively with many of the important generals of his time, such as Ian Hamilton, Henry Wilson, Gerald Ellison. In the law, you simply cannot rise to becoming twice Lord Chancellor, the first time from 1912 to 1915, and at the same time as a judge, President of the Judicial Appeals Committee of the Privy Council, without knowing most senior lawyers and judges in the UK and many overseas. And happily, the correspondence also reveals his love of the seriously competent administrators and civil servants of his time in many departments, like Hankey, the first cabinet secretary, Muir Mackenzie in the Lord Chancellor's department, and Morant at education. Each of them in turn loved him, not something one sees much in political life today. In his beloved field of philosophy, Bosanquet, Hume Brown, Seth Pringle Patterson were his particular friends and significant correspondents. His dedicated commitment to the expansion of university education fueled his interactions with phalanxes of the educational great. But his 40 years of work and correspondence with Beatrice and Sidney Webb, the great educational and social pioneering partnership, as we'll see later, was particularly inspiring. This work in both education and politics brought him closely into contact with the royal family, who were then very much more influential in political life than they are today. Haldane was the confidant of Edward VII and worked productively with key courtiers like Viscount Esher and later under George V, Lord Stamfordham. The letters are all there. The NLS correspondence also evidences the assiduity of his cultivation of philanthropists whose support he needed to fund these great university education projects. Various Rothschilds, Andrew Carnegie, the Randlords, Rhodes, Werner, the Bites, Sir Ernest Cassel were particularly generous. Cassel alone providing Haldane with the equivalent of £50 million in today's money to fund his various educational schemes. And his devotion to scientific method and to science is also apparent. He was a fellow of both the Royal Society and of the British Academy. He was able to hold his own with the great scientists, Eddington, Rayleigh, J.J. Thomson. He was fascinated with relativity, not just in scientific, but also in philosophical terms, which led him to write a major book entitled The Reign of Relativity. Just after the end of the war, Haldane invited Einstein and his wife Elsa to make a first visit to Britain and to stay with him in his London home. Here they are together just at the back of their house in Queen Anne's Gate in London. Yes, all of those letters and very much more are available just up the road, providing one of the best and most affordable days out in Edinburgh. But let's return to Panmure House, and let me use Adam Smith as an early illustration of Haldane in thought and action. Let's go back to 1887. Haldane's now 31. In 2 years, he'll take silk, being made up to Queen's Counsel at the early age of 33, the youngest QC, so Haldane believed, for half a century. His specialist legal work, particularly in constitutional law, has resulted in him appearing solely before the highest courts in the land. Yet in parallel to this extraordinary achievement for one so young, he's pursued two further callings, philosophy and public service both in education and representative politics. In philosophy, he had, by the age of 27, together with his friend John Kemp, completed the first translation into English of Schopenhauer's formidable 3-volume work, The World as Will and Idea. He'd followed this by co-editing with Andrew Seth his own first book on philosophy, a serious collection of essays and philosophical criticism, which took forward a wider appreciation of Haldane's beloved doctrine of idealism, which we'll discuss later. In public service, as soon as he'd arrived in London, he'd made time to work and lecture amongst young men and women at Toynbee Hall, and to address social improvement. He was already thinking deeply about his own liberal, socially orientated political beliefs. At 24, he was a leading element in forming the 80 Club, which celebrated and built upon Gladstone's success in the 1880 general election. And at the age of only 29, in 1885, he became the Member of Parliament for Haddingtonshire in East Lothian. So what is it that he does in 1887 at the age of 31? Well, Adam here tonight has pipped me to it. With his love of political economy and moral philosophy, he writes The Life of Adam Smith, which he combines with an assessment of the relation of Smith's teaching to modern political life. This was the first dedicated life of Adam Smith to be written since the early days of the century, and did much to inform the public of Haldane's time about Smith's ideas. Now, why do I dwell on that, other than the happy coincidence of the connection between Haldane and where we are this evening? It's because of the practical influence of Adam Smith's thinking on Haldane as an example of his devotion to preparation and going back to first principles. Haldane predicted in that 1887 book on Smith that it was, I quote, the battle between free trade and protectionism that was likely once more to be fought out before the newly enfranchised electorate of this country. He continued, a very serious battle it's likely to be. 17 years later, when Joseph Chamberlain splits the Conservative Party over the question of free trade and declares himself for imperial preference and protectionism, this prediction of Haldane bears full fruit. The Liberal Party, much influenced by Haldane, chose to settle their own differences and unite under the banner of free trade. That policy brought them back into government in Campbell Bannerman's administration of 1905, the administration in which Haldane first takes ministerial office at the age of 49. So let me now turn to Haldane's statesmanship. Excuse me. Jesse Norman gave an admirable address on Adam Smith in this very place following the publication in 2018 of his book, Adam Smith, What He Thought and Why It Matters. In that talk, he recalled Adam Smith's memorable denunciation of what he called that, quote, insidious and crafty animal, vulgarly called the statesman or politician, whose counsels are directed by the momentary fluctuation of affairs. Now, I don't want to take on Smith nor Jesse Norman, but I do want to draw the distinction between the statesman and the politician by illustrating some of Haldane's statesmanship. For my own definition of a statesman is someone who by action today, however underappreciated or misunderstood, can head off the preventable evils of tomorrow. In these days, we witness little long-term thinking, few efforts to address the really big, longer-term questions. But Haldane relished those challenges, and the longevity of what he created is proof that statesmanship can still flourish. So let me give you a snapshot of Haldane's work in terms of some of the organizations whose shape he created, developed, or influenced. For it's the breadth of that work that led me to subtitle my book, The Forgotten Statesman Who Shaped Modern Britain. Here is Fides Watt's portrait depicting Haldane as Secretary of State for War. Over his 6 years at the War Office, his famous Haldane Army reforms totally transformed the army, which had proved so disastrously unfit for purpose in the Boer War. Holding the poisoned chalice of the seals of office of a department generally considered to be the toughest of all, to be the graveyard of political ambition, he reformed the unreformable. Absorbing 20% of government expenditure in 1905, the War Office was the largest government spending department. Interestingly, just larger in percentage terms than our largest ministry today, the Department of Health and Social Care. I often ask myself whether putting a Haldane into that department could resolve today's far from fit for purpose National Health Service. Come August 1914 and war, his creation as the centrepiece of the regular army, the British Expeditionary Force, played its pivotal role in preventing the early fall of Paris and thus saving Britain, France and our allies from the Kaiser's clutches. He created the Territorial Army, the Imperial General Staff, which coordinated and mobilized the forces of the Empire alongside those of the United Kingdom. He created the Officers' Training Corps, that genius idea which enabled the immediate, rapid scalability of the army at the outset of war. In aviation, he created the Royal Flying Corps and became the RAF, and in security and intelligence, the Secret Service Bureau, which became the forerunner of MI5 and MI6. Having been elevated to the Lords in 1911, still as Minister for War, to help steer through the reforming Parliament Bill, in 1912 he was appointed Lord Chancellor. In parallel, he became the President, as I've said, of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. That's the final appeals tribunal on all legal and constitutional matters of the whole empire. In short, the Supreme Court of the Empire. From then onwards, he was able as a judge to deploy both his legal and philosophical skills in the constitutional structure and development of the empire. Here we see Haldane in procession as Lord Chancellor to the House of Lords. As Lord Chancellor, he brought his brilliant practical mind to bear on every aspect of the work of what was then a massive unified department. Even his own job specification was not exempt from critical analysis. He believed that the conflicts inherent in his own personal duties and responsibilities required change. So, ever innovative, he advocated splitting parts of the Lord Chancellor's duties between three separate and distinct people: an independent chairman or Speaker of the House of Lords, an independent Chief Justice of a Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, and a separate Minister of Justice in charge of a Justice Department and accountable to the people through the House of Commons, thus leaving for the Lord Chancellor his central role as the principal legal advisor to the government. As always, wonderful clear thinking, but years ahead of his time. The Lord Speaker of the House of Lords was created in July 2006, the Minister of Justice in May 2007, and the Supreme Court in October 2009, each nearly 100 years after his recommendation. But Haldane's statesmanship extended well beyond his official work as Minister for War and Lord Chancellor. It can be seen in all of its brilliance in the field of education. And I want to dwell on this, as I think it links into his foundational philosophy, which I will then come to. Education for Haldane facilitates the mind to progress towards an ever more comprehensive vision of reality, one which does not become narrowly stuck on one abstraction. Of course, he was also deeply aware of the economic importance of an educated public. This was part of why he laid stress on ways to expand technical vocation and scientific training, as well as a broader humanistic education. But on an even more fundamental level, he knew from personal experience that a good education could provide the resources by which one could rise above the troubles and tragedies of the everyday. This was not only the path to a calm, strong, courageous and successful person. This was the path to a nation's prosperity. To be educated is to be given the opportunity for emancipation from those blinkered views that keep us from truly realizing our potential. Haldane's principal educational memorials lie in his educational work, but he also worked with determination to advance causes which remediated the lack of early education. He actively supported Mansbridge's Workers' Education Association, formed in 1903. He created, in 1921, the British Institute of Adult Education, and he constantly promoted technical education and continuation schools. The university system in Britain, which was the real Haldane work, at that time was very much narrower than we know today. Scotland easily led the field in terms of universities per head of population. Here there were 4 universities, Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow and St Andrews, each established in the 15th, 16th centuries. In Ireland there were 2 universities, the 16th century Trinity College Dublin and the Queen's University of Ireland, with constituent colleges in Belfast, Cork and Galway. That was established in 1850. And then there was the University of Wales, the sole university in that principality, which was founded in 1893. But in England, there were only 5 universities. The 2 ancient foundations of Oxford and Cambridge, and many years later, in the early 19th century, Durham, then London, comprising University College and King's College, and most recently in 1880, the Victoria University, of which I'll talk further, with its 3 constituent colleges in Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds. In 1894, hand in hand with Sidney and Beatrice Webb, he supports the pioneering formation of the London School of Economics and Political Science, providing legal advice and bringing his network of philanthropic friends, in particular Lord Rothschild, to provide its early funding. The Webbs viewed Haldane as their co-founder and arranged for his portrait to hang alongside theirs in the founder's room at LSE. Next, we find Haldane in cross-party cooperation with the Conservatives, in office from 1895 to 1905, and especially with his philosopher friend A.J. Balfour, who became Prime Minister in 1902, to transform London University from a merely examining body for its constituent and other external colleges into a fully integrated teaching university. This was finally achieved in the hard-fought-over London University Act of 1898, on which Haldane worked tirelessly. At that time, the Irish MPs, whose crucial voting support was needed to pass that act, made it a condition of that support that Haldane should come over to Ireland and develop a blueprint for their own university system. The plans that he set out were finally enacted by the Liberal government, of which he was then part in 1908, and that created the Catholic-centric National University of Ireland, with colleges in Cork, Dublin and Galway, and the separate Protestant-centric Queen's University in Belfast. 1902 was a red-letter year for Haldane in the cause of university expansion, bringing the full force of his personality and legal understanding in order to bear on the corridors of power at the Privy Council, dominated by conservative aristocrats and politicians, but who recognised both the cross-party support that Haldane had given Balfour and the power of Haldane's arguments. He succeeded in bringing about a crucial change in regulation which allowed the concept of the modern civic university to be rolled out. Civic universities would thereafter be located in individual important cities, each supported by their local authority, by local business, by the local community, something the importance of which Haldane had been brought up to recognise in Scotland and had observed in action on the continent. It was his assiduous preliminary lobbying and preparation, combined with the dazzling evidence that he gave before the Committee of the Privy Council, that enabled the college in Liverpool to spring free from the tripartite Victoria University. That resulted in the parallel creation in 1903 and 1904 of the 3 new independent civic universities of Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds. They were quickly followed by Sheffield in 1905, Belfast in 1908, and Bristol in 1909, and by the university colleges of Reading, Nottingham and Southampton, each of whose foundation stones Haldane laid, and which would each go on to become the next 3 full civic universities within 25 years of his death. Here we have a photo of Haldane as Chancellor of Bristol University with George V at the opening of their new buildings in 1925. Haldane was by the early 1900s a trustee of the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, which, courtesy of his friend Andrew Carnegie, financed free university education for eligible Scottish children regardless of their means. By 1910, it was financing half of all undergraduates in Scotland. Perhaps this was a constituent reason for Haldane's enormous popularity with the students at Edinburgh University, where he was elected Lord Rector between 1906 and 1908. During his regular travels in Germany, Haldane had visited the great German Technische Hochschule, the technical high school at Charlottenburg in Berlin, which had fertilized in his mind the absence of a great technical university in Britain. It took him 5 years of assiduous preparatory work, lobbying, cajoling, enlisting the support of everyone from the London County Council to fellow politicians on both sides of the House, to academics, to financiers, to the King himself, to bring together in 1907 3 existing constituent colleges as the core of the new Imperial College of Science and Technology. He arranged for it to be endowed by a munificent £100,000, in today's money 10 million, raised from the landlords. And to round off this educational tour d'horizon, for 4 years, from 1910 to 1913, he chaired a royal commission into what he termed the ideal overall structure of university education in London, which inter alia led to the purchase of its famous Bloomsbury headquarters site. And in 1917 and 1918, the Royal Commission, he also chaired the Royal Commission into university education in Wales, whose far-reaching proposals he wrote to his mother temporarily made him even more popular in the Principality than Lloyd George. This lifetime's vocation to education concluded only months before his death in 1928 by being appointed Chancellor of St Andrews University to complement his Chancellorship of Bristol and the presidency of Birkbeck, London University's adult education college. But as I move on, please be aware that all the work that Haldane did in the educational field was done in what might be called his spare time. He never held any ministerial office in education. As we're here in Haldane's home country of Scotland and the land of enlightenment thinking, I want particularly, before I close, to discuss Haldane's philosophical foundations and his beliefs. Haldane was adamant that, quote, to see life steadily and to see it whole, to understand the world with its multitude of differing aspects, scientific, moral, aesthetic, religious, demanded a plurality of perspectives and disciplines. Haldane not only viewed philosophy as one of those important perspectives, it was his philosophical training that taught him the need for this plurality. We cannot understand Haldane's statesmanship if we fail to understand those philosophical beliefs. The passionate yet proselytizing Baptist religious beliefs of Haldane's parents were the dominant factor in his early intellectual life. But by the time he reached 16, he was unsure. As he wrote, it was religion of a somewhat emotional type, stimulated by a wave of feeling which at that time was pervading Scotland. But presently questions forced themselves upon me. Was the basic foundation of such feeling reliable? Haldane's youthful response was characteristic of how he dealt with all subsequent unsettlement. Quote, I began to read copiously, but he was unable to find the depth of reflection he was looking for in the established religious authors. Far more stimulating, he found, were the revolutionary writings of thinkers like David Friedrich Strauss, which put easy assurances of Jesus' divinity into question. Believing things on the basis of religious authorities was no longer an option for Haldane. He needed logical reasoning. Philosophy became his refuge. For a time, he couldn't work himself out of this muddle. Everything that he'd known and been taught about life's great questions was up in the air. And so it was at the instigation of Edinburgh's eccentric professor of Greek, John Stuart Blackie, it was decided the young Haldane ought to spend, at the age of 16, some months in Germany at the University of Göttingen, studying under the philosopher Hermann Lertz, before returning to his studies in Edinburgh. In the intellectual realm, Lertz completely changed the trajectory of Haldane's life. Lertz was the very embodiment of the pursuit of truth and the desire for knowledge. Lertz showed Haldane that philosophy could be more than a helpful resource for getting through life's muddles. It could be lived, it could be a vocation. It's no surprise that one of the first books Lertz recommended to Haldane was Johann Gottlieb Fichte's The Vocation of Man. That book had a profound impact on Haldane, with its stress for every individual on the importance of a life acting in accordance with one's conscience and of seeking to eradicate inequality. Fichte wrote, "I am a priest of truth. If I should be pursued and hated for the truth's sake, or if I should die in its service, what more would I have done than what I simply had to do?" Those ideas that each of us has a purpose in the world, and the scholars as one of the most vital, had a profoundly inspirational effect on Haldane. It clearly appealed to him that one could give one's life to something that wasn't dependent on historical revelation, didn't require membership in a limited human community, both key aspects of the Christianity of his childhood. The idea, moreover, that the philosophical task could be bound up with the very fate of humanity and history was revelatory. Here was an activity that could give Haldane's life a point, and a grand one at that, even in a world where for him religious observances had become redundant. Haldane returned from Göttingen to Scotland mentally and physically transformed. Back here at Edinburgh University, his studies increased in intensity, and he was fortunate to be surrounded by friends of equal fervour. In particular, Andrew Seth, who would later become known as Andrew Seth Pringle Patterson, Professor of Logic, Rhetoric and Metaphysics at St Andrews. His talent was obvious, and Haldane saw his philosophical studies as a kind of preparation, a bulwark against the inevitable fluctuations of future success and failure, a grounding in the values and eternal verities which made sense of the social and political actions that would form his public life. He became immersed in the groundbreaking philosophical thinkers of the day, especially James Hutchinson Stirling, Edward Caird, and T.H. Green, who came to be known as the British idealists. T.H. Green, more than any other perhaps, was responsible for the rise of this movement. He was an Oxford philosopher, and so Haldane did not study directly under him, although Asquith did, but Green's emphasis on the social responsibilities of the philosopher, his belief that human fulfillment and freedom could be found in the active exercise of one's citizenship within the state. Each of these would mark out Green as a philosophical master worthy of Haldane's discipleship. And here we see Haldane's hand resting on the work of Green's. The constellation of thinkers who contributed to Haldane's own first philosophical book, Essays in Philosophical Criticism, in 1883, such as Bernard Bosanquet and Henry Jones, would become not only the leading lights of the next generation of British philosophers, but also close associates of Haldane. Woven closely into this is the thinking of Hegel, who died in 1831. It was Hegel who most enthralled Haldane. Haldane considered him to be the greatest, quote, the greatest master of abstract thought that the world has seen since the day when Aristotle died. He believed that the Hegelian claim that, quote, the spiritual alone is the real was one of life's most vital truths. So important that he had those words carved in the original German into the wooden cornice of his bookcase in the library at Cologne, where they remain today. Haldane somehow continued his philosophical work despite all his legal, political, and educational commitments. So reach forward to 1902, and we find Haldane, by then a QC at the peak of his profession, an MP for nearly 20 years, and not least, as we've seen that year with his civic universities, a devoted educational reformer, invited by the University of St Andrews to give the prestigious Gifford Lectures. He dedicated those 14 lectures, delivered extempore over 2 academic years, which when printed ran to over 600 pages, to what he learned from Hegel and how he interpreted his idealism. It's a reflection of his scholarship that he was at the same time offered the chair of moral philosophy at St Andrews, no mean achievement for a non-fully academic philosopher. In Haldane's time, a philosophically grounded public servant, and more rarely a philosopher statesman, was a species that could still live and breathe. A philosophical education, as it was in the latter decades of the 19th century when idealism reigned supreme, could inspire a young man or woman with the hope that their actions could have world-changing consequences. It could assure them that there was a deep bond uniting all human beings. Hegel called this deep bond Geist, meaning spirit. It could tell them something about the liberating effect of living as a responsible citizen within society. And that is why I place my hopes for a resurrection of a better politics in our nation today, in the resurrection of the doctrine and the teaching of the ennobling principles of idealism in our universities. But following the First World War, the doctrine of realism took firmer root in the English universities, and that remains so even today. Realism is a view not easily summarized, but which fiercely repudiated the idealist claim that thinking affected the reality of the thing that's being thought about. Instead, it focused heavily on philosophical semantics. In the 1930s, a notable and admirable exception to this change of thinking was the Oxford philosopher R.G. Collingwood. He considered the whole bent of the realist school to be one that undermined the earlier vision of philosophy as a possible guide to life. He wrote, quote, "If the realists had wanted to train up a generation of Englishmen and English women expressly as the potential dupes of every adventurer in morals or politics, commerce or religion, who should appeal to their emotions and promise them private gains which he neither could procure them nor even meant to procure them, no better way of doing it could have been discovered." What a warning, especially when we note that he wrote that in 1938. How equally relevant I believe those words to be today. For as we turn to Haldane's philosophical outlook, in itself so optimistic, it may well seem alien and hard to reconcile with our contemporary view of the world, and you may well be inclined to raise a skeptical eyebrow and question its relevance. On the other hand, our present national and international life may create in you a longing for a restored optimism, in which case you may find the seeds of hope in the achievements of Haldane, which were so driven by his belief in idealism. Haldane held that a key function of philosophy was its ability to recover and harmonize all the many differing viewpoints within the world, including the differing viewpoints of science and philosophy. He argued that if we consider the workings of the mind closely and carefully enough, with philosophical rigor, that is, we discover that all individual views of the world simply represent what he called different categories or degrees within reality, which are determined by the purposes we have in mind when we engage with the world before us. The implications of that view for Haldane's statecraft are significant. When faced with a difficulty, say the reorganization of the army, his style was always to consult others. In this case, the army's senior officers and many others, each with their own specialist knowledge, adding new perspectives to his own, building a fuller picture of the problem and its possible solutions. His predecessors at the War Office had failed precisely because of their unwillingness to take this range of views seriously, clinging obstinately to their own individual ideas of what the army should be. But Haldane was wise enough to know that he could never be in sole possession of the true, complete view of things. As he said, reality is more than what in each case it's been taken by abstraction to be, and if it is so, no single order of conceptions is adequate to a complete explanation. This tolerance, indeed this welcome of others' conception of reality, this philosophical wariness about branding one view of reality right and another wrong, is also part of why Haldane worked so well with others, both within and outside his own political party. And this undoubtedly related to his decision to leave the Liberals and join the first Labour government in 1924 in pursuit of the overriding cause of education. Here's a photograph of Haldane next to Ramsay MacDonald, on Ramsay MacDonald's left as you look at the picture, with his cabinet in the garden of Downing Street. This approach, principle above party, was central to Haldane's statesmanship. The continual struggle for the best on behalf of others, often to the detriment of his own health and comfort. The apparent serenity in the face of troubles. These can all be accounted for when we consider the philosophy that underpins his political activity. As Haldane once tellingly observed, and I think that the recent death of Alexei Navalny inspiringly resonates in this context, quote, "It's the man who accepts his obligations to those around him and who does his work in his station, whatever that station may be, with indifference as to the consequence to himself and without thought of what may happen to him individually, who makes the real impression." As Fichte had taught him, if I'm to die in the service of truth, what more could I have done than what I simply had to do? Haldane's exalted understanding of the human mind also helps us to understand why he was at such pains to emphasize the power of thinking. It was at one with the divine. He had a profound faith in the capacity of thought to solve a problem, even the most intractable. In his autobiography written just before his death, Haldane relates that he had offered to have the words, quote, "thinking costs nothing," put up in letters of gold on the walls of the War Office. Haldane, whose debt to T.H. Green's reading of Hegel is apparent throughout his reflections on the state, put this in his own unique way. Knowledge is power, but knowledge must not be merely abstract and material. It must be knowledge of those things that are high and spiritual, a knowledge that tells men and women that the state is largely their own lives, and that their own lives are a trust to be carried out for the benefit of those around them as well as for themselves. What seems to be implied in that notion of freedom, which focuses on self-satisfaction at the expense of others, and not notions of freedom that focus on self-satisfaction at the expense of others, are not really representative of freedom at all. Or if they are, then they're representative of the most undeveloped form of freedom and are deeply deficient. It's only when we begin to will, in common with others, to seek together the unifying underlying truth and good, that we begin to discover concrete freedom. By the British idealist's account, that ability to be oneself and to be oneself and with and for others is freedom. As Henry Jones said, the state and the citizen both share the same destiny. The state exists to provide the conditions and means for the development of citizens. Which brings me to the close of these philosophical comments with just some last words from Haldane's preface to the 1919 edition of The New State, a book written by his friend, the Bostonian Mary Follett, whose work Haldane so greatly admired. I quote, "The cardinal doctrine of her book," he wrote this in the preface, "is that the state is what its members make it to be. The practical consequences of that doctrine struck Haldane as particularly important, so he went on further. Neighbourhood education and neighbourhood organisation is then the pressing problem of 1918. All those who are looking towards a real democracy, not the pretense of one which we have now, feel that the most imminent of our needs is the awakening and invigorating, the educating and organising of the local unit. All those who in the humblest way, in settlement or community centre, are working for this, are working at the greatest political problem of the 20th century. In many respects, I think that remains the case today. For what Mary Follett and Haldane meant by this was that for a state to be effective, it should be built from the bottom up. That has enormous importance for constitutional affairs today, not least in the relationship between Scotland and the United Kingdom. Haldane's and Follett's philosophical beliefs favoured keeping every power and responsibility which could be effectively and efficiently deployed as close as possible to the individuals affected. And what this means is that each of us should have the maximum ability to run our own family and home free from interference, but in a way that's neighbourly. So it follows that we must individually also be a willing part of our village or local community where certain matters for our mutual benefit can be better and more efficiently organised together. And equally, going wider, we should ourselves then pass upwards to a greater level, but one in which we as individuals remain an integral part. All activity which can be better or more efficiently carried out at that level, be that our country, be that the United Kingdom, be that the international bodies we choose to work with, whether it's the European Court of Human Justice, the tribunals at The Hague, the Commonwealth, the United Nations, NATO, the World Bank, whatever your fancy, you are an integral part of every one of those organizations because one's seen the efficiency of passing that responsibility higher, but you stay part of each level as one goes higher. So the key for democracy and for the creation of the strong state is that it's built upon the desire of each of us as individuals to embrace and be part of that wider fellowship, and that each of us as individuals remains an integral part of every single one of those wider and greater circles. So let me conclude with a brief summary of some of the underlying essential elements that after his death in 1928 have ensured that what Haldane built has lived on to influence modern Britain, even if his name is so often forgotten. And to accompany them, here's a portrait of a very much thinner and unwell Haldane, painted by de Laszlo literally months before his death at the age of 72. To my mind, these Haldanean essential elements lie in the unusual combination of the principles that guided him and the techniques he used to build upon them. I believe that 5 in particular stand out. The first is the importance of returning to first principles. In his insistence that thinking costs nothing and that thought must precede action. It's this that allowed Haldane to define the key questions, to see things whole, to fit each component element of his work into an organism that could live and breathe, develop and grow over the longer term. Hence the immense importance he placed on independent research, not designed to reflect a politically expedient agenda. Hence too his passion for being philosophically rigorous in all his undertakings. No politician of the modern age in Britain has ever attempted to put his or her philosophy into practice in the way that Haldane did. The second core principle is that investment in education is the best investment that any nation can make. Haldane's ability to act upon this conviction means that none can rival his contribution to the university landscape in Britain. His success lay in some key Haldanian techniques: establishing principles, focus on clear deliverables, marshal influential support, ensuring a sound financial footing for every endeavour, and in his many speaking engagements and through his books, inspiring his audience with the loftiness of his cause. The third principle is that decisions should be taken as close as possible to the people that they affect. Haldane's stances on Home Rule for Ireland and on provincial autonomy in Canada show his commitment in his time to this ideal. I would love to have had time to explain how I believe Haldane's judicial devolution of powers from the Dominion to the provinces in his judgment helped posthumously in 1995, 67 years after his death, in saving the integrity of Canada through diluting the vote in favour of the succession of Quebec. You'll remember it was 50.6 to 49.4% to stay in Canada. The fourth Haldane principle is to balance realism with idealism, in the sense of recognizing the importance of timing in relation to effecting change. Haldane recognized there was no point in seeking to drive radical change at a pace which would have been simply rejected by a House of Lords then dominated by the Conservatives. The compromises he made to get his army reforms through Parliament pre the Reforming Parliament Act of 1911 again illustrate this point. He was fully conscious that in politics a developed sense of timing, along with a subtle, pragmatic approach, determines what can be achieved just as much as the ability to articulate the big arguments. And the fifth essential Haldane principle is a recourse to statesmanship rather than to politics. Haldane's approach to cross-party cooperation demonstrates the true difference, I believe, in the approach between the statesman and the politician. The statesman is someone who holds certain well-thought-through views and opinions that transcend day-to-day party political life. Haldane recognized that cross-party cooperation often led to the most valuable policies. His legacy in education and defence amply bears out the wisdom of such a conviction. But these 5 principles would count for little if they were not underwritten by a fundamental idealistic belief in the transformational capacity of the human spirit and a corresponding goodness of character. It was Haldane's moral quality and his depth that lifted him to the highest level of statesmanship. That's why I'm convinced that the study of Haldane can be more than just a study of history, that his work and thinking can be read as a handbook of leadership and statesmanship. I often think, and I'm sustained by the thought, that a Haldanian approach to public affairs could be beneficial in addressing many of our current dilemmas. Perhaps what's needed is that the study of Haldane, this remarkable Scot, this light of Caledonia, should become a set subject in our nation's schools and universities. Thank you very much.
That was a fascinating lecture of a fascinating book, which I very much enjoyed reading. And why I enjoyed reading it is that Haldane is so, I don't want to use the word inspirational, but I'm going to use the word inspirational because he is able to marry the need for deep thinking and the courage to be an intellectual, but while also looking for pragmatic solutions. What I also like about Haldane is that he was willing to change his political affiliation, to be flexible in terms of sticking with his ideals. You didn't mention in his lecture, but his openness to Germany or German culture, he spoke German after I had spent time there, was actually went against him politically in the early part of the 20th century. But that encounter, if you like, with Germany, as you mentioned, his enjoyment or his following of Hegel, actually shaped his Scots foundation through Adam Smith, but then brought it together. We're bringing the kind of pragmatism of the Scots and the empiricism of the Scots with the idealism of Hegel, and that follows through in his practical politics and his architecture and his building of modern Britain. So I find that's why I agree that we should read him more. He should be up there in the canon of great British statesmen, along with Churchill or Thatcher, if you're of those politics. But Haldane's name is rarely, if ever, mentioned, and I find that to be.
Yeah, I think that was one of the great sadnesses that I felt when I began to get to know Haldane, going back tens and tens of years, not tens of years, 20, 30, 40 years back, that here was this man who did so much, who had a recipe for being able to work out what needed to be done, and then the brilliant emotional intelligence to work out how to make it happen, when every single thing he did was the people who were opposing it. The vested interests always want the conventional, what's there at the time that he was set out to bring about change. Change is never popular, and he somehow was able to do it. And I think that's what the philosophical side really taught him, and plus I think an amazing ability to read people well. And there hasn't been a chance to talk about his domestic life, and other than mentioning his mother, his sister, but then Haldane fell passionately in love on 2 occasions and was rejected on both occasions. And then for the last 30 years of his life, his amanuensis was a remarkable woman, Frances Horner, Lady Horner. And that was a very, very important influence on him as well. So there's so many, it's not like a Koh-i-Noor, there are so many facets to the diamond. You never know what to try to work into any 45 minutes, because he worked with, say, 4 or 5 hours sleep, 16, 17 hours a day from the age of 16 till he died at 72, still writing his last judgment on a Canadian case. And he literally worked himself to death. So it's extraordinary, that commitment that you can have. And I've got a real sense that somehow if his story was known more widely, then it might encourage a different type of person to come into politics, that in additional to the people at the moment who very often it's driven by the ability to be very fluent on a public stage rather than actually sit back and think. And he would go to Cloan to do his thinking. Do you want me to touch on the German side? Because
I think it's useful.
Lest you think one's somehow deliberately ignoring, but it just was impossible to do it. And there he goes off to Germany. He learns to speak fluent German at the age of 16, and he loves all the German philosophers. He loves German art. He loves the German scientific mind. He studied their university system, their school systems, the Kirchsteiners, continuing education for apprentices in Munich. And he just was a master of the facts. And he was deeply, deeply concerned that Germany was really rapidly going to overtake Britain in terms of an economic power, because they were just so incredibly well organized. The German mind is much more organized. There was a wonderful lecture he gave at Oxford in 1912 on the German mind, and today probably to be banned. You wouldn't be allowed to have a discussion of that kind. But it was really trying to say we've got to understand how other people work. So he was constantly quoting German sources forces where it was relevant to use what they had achieved as a encouragement to Britain to pull their socks up, face up to what's going on with trade, say with aniline dyes and things like that, the science behind it all, which the Germans had completely taken over from us. And so when war comes in 1914, there's Haldane, who's loved Germany, who's got to know the Kaiser pretty well. He's had a key, 3 days, he went out in 1912 on a secret mission, which the government never formally acknowledged it happened. Everybody knew something was happening, but the government, Asquith, refused to talk about it. But he was sent as a plenipotentiary to debate with the Kaiser, with Bethmann Hollweg, the Chancellor of Germany, and Tirpitz, the head of the Navy. Everything that you could possibly be done to try to head off the war. What was, where could something be done which, while maintaining the principles of obviously that on both sides could be achieved? And he thought he'd almost got there, and then in the end it fell through after he got back. And when the Kaiser came to London in 1911 for the King George's for the coronation, that the Kaiser invited himself to lunch in Haldane's home. The generals were coming to have lunch in any event, but the Kaiser invited himself along. That he'd met him he'd gone out to Germany and met the Kaiser in 1906, when the Kaiser, because he spoke fluent German, allowed Haldane the complete run of the German War Office. He could go to any room he wanted to go into. They said there were no files on an invasion of Britain that were there, so you just go where you want. And so that he really had studied Germany. So of course, come the war, when you consider how bitterly he'd been opposed on the way up to the war, and say the restructure of the army, when the Conservatives had got the Lords Lieutenant who had cherry-bottom trousers in one regiment in Northumberland, and pink epaulets or gold epaulets in another county. It all had to be knocked into shape. That this was the moment when the Conservatives could hit back on the guy that they felt he'd pontificated. Nobody likes an intellectual in Britain. It's a species that's rather disliked by the public. And so that with the press, with the Northcliffe press, they turned violently against Haldane. And as soon as he was seen going into the War Office, because there was no Minister of War at the outbreak of war, and Asquith was temporarily holding the seals of office after the Curragh mutiny about 5 months before that. And so he sent Haldane to go and implement the plans that Haldane put in to mobilize the army. He was seen going into the War Office, and immediately the Northcliffe press said, "What's Haldane doing at the War Office?" And that led to Kitchener, who Haldane did support Kitchener to get the job, but actually he shouldn't have done it. And Kitchener was wonderful with his great hand going out, but he was absolutely impossible as a Minister for War in the cabinet. Absolutely impossible. It was one of the major errors of the war. So come the coalition in May 1915, the Conservatives extract their pound of flesh, and they refuse to serve in the coalition if Haldane stayed in government. So you've got the cleverest guy in government, the man that prepared us and saved the country by getting the British Expeditionary Force out there, understood the German mind, thrown out of the cabinet at the point of maximum need. So there were, as you say, it was a tragic thing. Now he came back after the war, and by his death in 1928, his reputation was significantly recovered for those that cared, but so many didn't. Millions were dead. Why bother to resurrect the name of the statesman? Let's just get on with other things. That's a totally understandable thing.
So I imagine the audience is wondering about the contemporary relevance of Haldane. Yeah. And you touched on this in your lectures, that how do we get people today, the politicians of today, to be those effective, deep-thinking statespeople that care about solving big problems?
Well, it's incredibly difficult, as we all know. One of the joys of writing the book is that quite a number, if you go to my haldane.com website, that people that very kindly read the book or sent in notes on it have been the heads of various services. And Gordon Brown, who you're very close to, has been a great follower of Haldane, largely as a result of the book. He knew a certain amount about him before, but the head of the Supreme Court and the head of MI6 and other people have all really doffed their cap to what they have really learned from the book and appreciating much more what Haldane was able to do. And that where to start? I won't spend the whole evening talking about it, but I'll give you just one example. Haldane in 1917 to 1918, out of government, took on the chairmanship of a royal commission. It wasn't a royal commission, it was a commission of a department into how Britain should be run after the war. And he looked at the structure of government. It was the structure of the British government, how it could be made efficient. And basically he wrote 70 or 80 pages saying the cabinet should only be 12 people, how all the departments should be reorganized, create a Ministry of Health, which was created in 1919, create the Medical Research Council, which were created. So a number of things happened, but basically getting the cabinet down to 12 people, which could be an operational unit, was completely ignored, been ignored by every prime minister since. 2 days ago, the Institute for Government came out with their great paper they spent a year doing, which basically said that cabinet government, Downing Street, the Cabinet Office, the Treasury does not function. It's impossible for those three organizations to work together. And what one's got to have is a new department of the civil service and to reallocate the responsibility so the Prime Minister can actually govern and get the support of the civil service, which at the moment he can't do. And that the Cabinet should effectively become a committee of 7 people. A committee of the Cabinet will be responsible for the main strategy of the nation. You can have, as a businessman, I know this, you can sit and have 7 people around the table and and take the time of those 7 productively. You can't have 30 people that attend cabinet today, including the attendees as well as the cabinet. You cannot take their time and have a serious discussion on anything. So you've got to start in so many new places, but if you're prepared to do it, the National Health Service, there's absolutely no reason, I believe, why you couldn't send for Kate Bingham today, put her in the House of Lords and say, Kate, you're in charge of, you're Minister of Health for the next 7 years, you're out of the Commons, out of the bear pit, you're not having to respond every 5 minutes to ridiculous slanders and slurs, work out the whole future of the health of the nation, and you've got 7 years to do it. That's where you get things done. We should use the House of Lords, which has got this wonderful flexibility of the British Constitution to put people in there instead of the rubbish of so many people that do go in there. Send some really clever people to sit in the House of Lords, but bring them into government. So have half your ministers that actually know how to run something more than a sweet shop, and the other half can do the political stuff.
So I don't want to dominate the conversation. I want to open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to go around. Someone have the courage. Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I wanted to focus on his career as a military reformer. Had he learned anything from the previous flagship reforms under Cardwell, and did that affect the way he tried to reorient the army towards continental commitment, which in theory Cardwell had tried to do, but obviously not succeeded particularly well at?
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. I think Cardwell was certainly the great earlier thinker who did so much to have, the regiment abroad and the regiment backed up at home. So Haldane very much kept that as a key element of what he was doing. What he essentially was dealing with was not it was the regular army, because when he first came in, in February 1906, I always get it mixed up, it was at Agadir, it was one of the Moroccan crises happened. And Edward Grey, who'd just become the foreign minister, got in touch with Haldane when it was actually at election time. There was an election immediately after the government had changed to confirm the change of government. And Gray said to Haldane, what plans have we got if we have to go to war against Germany? And Haldane sent a message he was up at Haddington, down to London, send me the files on it. There were no files. There were no plans at all for a continental engagement. And when he did the work over the next few days, he discovered it would take 16 weeks to get 80,000 people onto the continent of Europe. By the time he'd finished, it took, I think it was 5 weeks to get 160,000 people onto the continent. So he made the whole mobilization of the expeditionary force so much more efficient. But where his real work was being done, over and beyond all of that, was to sort out the yeomanry, the militia, the volunteers, to make them all fit for purpose, to get them coordinated, to make sure they were all speaking the same language, using the same type of guns. It was putting some intelligence into place with MI5 and MI6. Eventually, it was getting the RAF into place. So there was an enormous amount in the Field Service Office regulations, that the handbook as to how the army operates on a day-to-day basis in a crisis, that it all had to be written. And he brought Haig back from India, or Isha, and he brought Haig back from India, just as a major general, to be the thinking man in the department. It was enormous, but it was 5 years totally dedicated work by a minister, although he was at the same time doing his education and other things, but no other minister would ever have put in that amount of dangerous work, and opposed by the Conservatives on quite a number of occasions. He didn't get them through as cleanly as he would have wanted, but being pragmatic, better to get some progress than not progress at all. Yeah.
Wait for it's just for the recording.
Oh, hello. First, thank you so much for your enthusiasm and energy.
No, it's on. If you just
on?
speak, if you just project, please.
Okay. Sorry, start again. Thank you so much for your so passionate voice and expression. On the more personal question, Professor Adam Dixon said when you met, you were 12 years old, and then took you quite some time to come to write this book.
Yes.
And do you have a sort of a personal or career turning point which brought you be liberal and endorse Haldane, started to find out about him? Thank you so much.
That's kind of you to ask that. No, I have to say it was much more simple, that I had to work my passage in life. And so when I set my firm up after I left Angus Grossart here in 1988, and my firm is now 37 years old, that when I got to 2009, I began to think I'd really like to start to reduce and write the book. I've been researching in many ways, and I remember at Cloan in 2007 for the centenary of the territorials, we had that great discussion with the Duke of Westminster and 30-odd, the most senior officers of the territorial army came to Cloan to think out the future of the territorial army in the atmosphere where Haldane had done the foundational thinking. So I'd done a few things, but it was really when I began to reduce in my company, really 2011 to be fair, that I began to do it. And can I just say here, when we're being recorded, because Richard McLaughlin can't be here, I have to put on record my appreciation of the work for the last 5 of those 9 years of a brilliant PhD based here in Edinburgh, who eventually I was introduced to, who was able to go into the archives and really get much more material out of me, save me travelling all the time from London. And then not only did that, he could hold my hand and cut me down. I'm very verbose, so he's the master at turning 10,000 words into 4,000 words. So he was, I call him my collaborator on the book, and he was very influential. So it was just when I had the time to do it. But it's been pretty full on for 9 years till 2020 to get the book done, and then since then I've been just trying to spread the word when invited to do so.
We have time for one more question. Back there.
Why do you think, Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Why do you think somebody of this incredible talent and ability failed to do what most of us do, which is to find a long-term sexual partner?
Yes.
And I mean, you mentioned the fact that he was interested in a couple of women. Here's a guy of immense ability and immense energy. My question, it puzzles me that in this area, he failed.
Yep.
So did Adam Smith.
He tried as well. No, Haldane had I suppose the shortcut was that if you're going to fall in love with the sister of one of your male friends. So it's in the group, so to speak. So his first was with Agnes Kemp when he was in his early 20s down in London. And he couldn't persuade her, and so he failed in that. So I suppose maybe at that stage that he hadn't developed a sufficient emotional intelligence perhaps to really understand the workings of the young, probably the young male mind in love, let alone how females react to a young male in love, because he was absolutely devastated by the fact that she rejected him. He just couldn't believe it. And then, of course, he actually became engaged to Val Munro Ferguson, the sister of Ronald Munro Ferguson, another political friend of Nova and here in Scotland. And she broke off the engagement just a number of weeks. In those days, you became engaged just a short time before getting married. So all the presents arrived. She broke it off a few weeks later. And she eventually went into a lesbian relationship with a singer, Mary Wakefield, and died 7 years later in Westmoreland, in Kendal. And so, what had gone wrong there, I don't know. Did she withdraw, thinking maybe she would be damaging to his career, or did he fail? Where the faults lie, I don't know. But finally, in 1893, he meets Frances Horner, and married to Sir John Horner of Mells, a very ancient family down in the West Country in Somerset. And he was able to have a wonderful relationship with her for 35 years, unrequited, as she said, unconsummated. I didn't think any sex ever came into it, but it was a meeting of minds. I don't know. And one of the great debates we had on...
He's a very effective operator.
Yeah.
How did he fail to persuade?
I don't know. The question would be, was he gay? And now we'd struggle with that thing because there's absolutely no evidence we could get of anything that would indicate that. But potentially, maybe quietly, that was one just has no idea. But there was absolutely no evidence for it. So it's one of the great conundrum that, Peter, you're right, that we all fail at some things and some of us fail rather badly. He failed fairly well on the whole, but he wasn't perfect. Sorry, Peter.
Thank you.
But he was still an extraordinary individual, and you've written an extraordinary book full of history of modern Britain that is still with us today, and I think a message for how politicians and civil servants and the broader community can build a better nation, not simply here in Britain, but I think in other democracies around the world. And so on that, I'd like to thank Campbell for coming to Panmure House and speaking on another Smith aficionado, Haldane himself. And so if we could please give Campbell a round of applause.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.